The pups were screaming again, and nobody in the great hall could make it stop. Cale Ashworth stood near the window with his jaw locked tight, watching the newest candidate stumble backward with a torn sleeve and wide, frightened eyes. She was the fifth one this month. Behind her, his 2-year-old twins, Wren and Rue, bared tiny teeth and pressed themselves against the nursery wall like cornered animals. Their eyes glowed faint gold, a sign that their wolf side was close to the surface, even though true shifting was years away. "Alpha, I am so sorry. I only tried to hold Rue's hand," the young woman said, clutching her wrist. A thin red mark rose across her skin where small teeth had caught her. Cale did not answer right away. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and knelt in front of his children, lowering his voice the way his own father used to do before he passed the pack down to him. "Wren, Rue, enough." The twins did not calm. If anything, Rue's small growl deepened, and Wren stepped in front of her brother as if guarding him, though it was usually the other way around. Cale felt the familiar ache rise in his chest, the one that had lived there since the night his mate, Elira, died bringing these two into the world. He had promised her, in the last moments, when her hand had gone cold in his, that he would raise them well. He had promised the pack elders the same thing in a different way, that he would remarry, that he would give the twins a mother, that he would give the Ashworth pack the stability a Luna brought to a bloodline. He had not expected that promise to be this hard to keep. "Take her to the healer," Cale said to Finn Callahan, his beta and oldest friend, who stood near the door with his arms crossed and a look of quiet exhaustion on his face. Finn nodded and gently guided the shaken candidate out of the hall. When the door shut, Cale let out a slow breath and turned back to his children. The gold in their eyes had already faded, and now they looked like ordinary toddlers again, 2 small faces streaked with tears, 2 small chests still heaving from the fright of a stranger's hand reaching toward them. "What is wrong with them?" Cale whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. No one answered. No one ever did. Down the hall, far from the noise of the great hall, a young woman named Mira Hollis knelt on the cold stone floor, with a bucket of soapy water beside her. She had heard the commotion from 2 corridors away, the raised voices, the candidate's startled cry, the low warning growl of children too young to understand what a growl even meant. She did not look up from her work. Servants who looked up too much often found themselves out of a position entirely. Mira's fingers moved quickly over the floor tiles, wringing the cloth, wiping, wringing again. A strand of dark hair fell across her face, and she tucked it back with the side of her wrist, careful not to let her fingers touch the scar that ran along the edge of her jaw. It was an old habit, hiding that mark, though most of the household had long since stopped staring at it. Most, but not all. "There she is, scrubbing away like the world hasn't ended," came a voice from behind her. Mira did not need to turn to know it belonged to Greta, the head of the kitchen staff, a broad-shouldered woman with a sharp tongue and very little patience for anyone she considered beneath her attention. Another candidate sent running. "The Alpha will never find a Luna at this rate. Those pups are cursed, if you ask me." "Nobody asked you," Mira said quietly, still scrubbing. Greta scoffed and walked on, her heels clicking against the stone, leaving Mira alone again, with her bucket and her thoughts. Mira had been in service to the Ashworth pack for almost 2 years now, ever since she arrived at the gates with nothing but the clothes on her back, and a story she never told anyone in full. She kept to the edges of rooms, the shadows of hallways, the parts of the pack house where nobody thought to look. It was safer that way. Being unseen meant being unquestioned, and being unquestioned meant no one asked about the scar, or about the family she never spoke of, or about the fire that still visited her most nights in dreams she could not outrun. She finished the floor and gathered her supplies, moving toward the servant stairs that led up past the family wing. It was not her usual route, but a linen order needed delivering to the nursery, and the younger maid, who normally carried such things, had taken ill that morning. Mira did not mind. The nursery, at least, was quiet at this hour, well after the candidate had been sent away and before the twins' evening meal. Or so she thought. As she reached the nursery door, she heard something that made her stop entirely, not screaming this time. Not growling, small broken sobs, muffled, the kind children make when they think no one is listening, and there is no comfort to be found anywhere in the world. Mira knew that she should knock, announce herself, and leave the linens with whichever nursemaid was on duty. That was the correct thing to do. Instead, she found herself pushing the door open just a crack, peering inside. The nursery was empty of adults. A single lamp burned low on the table, casting long shadows across two small beds pushed close together in the center of the room. Ren and Rue sat huddled on the floor between them, arms wrapped tightly around each other, both crying in that hopeless way that comes from being frightened and utterly alone. Where was the nursemaid? Mira glanced down the hallway and saw no one. She would learn later that the woman assigned to the twins that evening had slipped out to fetch a cup of tea, thinking the children had finally settled after their earlier fright, not realizing a nightmare would grip them the moment she left the room. Mira knew she should wait. She knew this was not her place. But something in her chest, some old and familiar ache, pulled her forward before her mind could argue with her feet. She set down the basket of linens just inside the door and crossed the room slowly, the way she used to approach her younger siblings long ago, back when the world had still made sense, back before the fire took everything from her in a single terrible night. She had learned, in that other life, exactly how to make frightened children feel safe again. "Hello there," she whispered, lowering herself to the floor beside them, careful to keep her voice soft and unhurried. "What's all this crying about, Ren looked up first, his small face blotchy and wet, his golden eyes still faintly glowing with the last traces of his distress. He did not growl, he did not bite, he simply stared at her, as if trying to decide whether she was a threat or something else entirely. Rue buried her face deeper into her brother's shoulder, but her small shoulders had stopped shaking quite so violently. "It's all right," Mira said, keeping her hands folded loosely in her lap, making no move to grab or reach or startle them, the way every candidate before her had done. "You don't have to talk to me. I'll just sit here a while, if that's all right with you." She began, very softly, to hum. It was an old tune, one her mother used to sing when she was small, one that had no real words attached to it anymore, only a melody that rose and fell like gentle water. She had not hummed it in years. She was surprised her voice still remembered how. Slowly, Ren's grip on his sister loosened. Rue lifted her head, blinking up at the stranger with the soft voice and the kind eyes, and something in her small chest seemed to settle. The glow in their eyes faded entirely, replaced by ordinary childlike curiosity. "Mama?" Rue whispered, so quietly that Mira almost did not hear it, and the word struck her like a blow to the ribs. "No, sweetheart," Mira said gently, her throat suddenly tight. "Not your mama, just a friend for now." But Rue had already crawled forward and pressed herself into Mira's side, small fingers curling into the fabric of her apron, and Ren followed a moment later, tucking himself against her other arm. Mira sat frozen for a long moment, unsure what to do, her heart pounding with something between fear and an emotion she had not let herself feel in a very long time. She continued humming, softer now, and within minutes both children had drifted into an easy sleep, their small chests rising and falling in peaceful rhythm, nothing at all like the terrified creatures who had bitten and clawed at every noble candidate brought before them. The nursemaid returned a short while later, tea in hand, and stopped short in the doorway at the sight before her. Mira, sensing the presence, carefully eased herself away from the sleeping twins, laid them gently onto their beds, and gathered her basket of linens without a word. "You should not be in here," the nursemaid said, though her voice carried more surprise than anger. "I know," Mira said quietly. "I'm sorry. I heard them crying, and no one else was here." The nursemaid glanced at the twins, sleeping soundly for the first time in days, and said nothing more. Mira slipped out of the room and hurried back down the servant stairs, her heart still hammering, the warmth of two small bodies pressed against her sides lingering long after they were gone. She told herself it meant nothing. She was a servant. The twins were the Alpha's children, heirs to the Ashworth bloodline, destined for a life she could never be part of. Whatever had happened in that nursery was a small, strange accident, nothing more, and she resolved to never speak of it to anyone. She did not know, as she carried her empty basket back toward the kitchens, that Cale Ashworth had returned early from his meeting with the pack elders and was standing at the top of the stairs, having witnessed the tail end of the scene through the nursery's open door. He had seen his children, silent and settled, clinging to a servant girl he did not recognize, her voice still humming faintly as she slipped away into the shadows of the hallway. He said nothing. He simply watched her go, a strange and unfamiliar thought taking root in his mind, one he was not yet ready to examine too closely. For the first time in longer than he could remember, his sons had stopped crying, and it had not taken a noble bloodline or a carefully arranged introduction to do it. It had taken nothing more than a quiet voice, a gentle touch, and a servant girl whose name he did not even know. The pack house grew quiet as evening settled over the grounds, torches lit one by one along the stone walls, the scent of the coming night drifting through open windows. Cale stood alone in the hallway long after Mira had disappeared down the servant stairs, his mind turning over what he had just seen. He thought of Alira, as he often did in quiet moments like this one. She would have known what to do with children like Ren and Rue. She would have known how to soothe their fears without a single wasted word, the way their mysterious visitor had done tonight. He wondered, not for the first time, whether some piece of his son's unease came from missing a mother they had never truly known, a mother whose absence they somehow still felt in their small, growing hearts. He walked slowly toward his study, passing the portraits of Ashworth alphas long since gone, each one watching him with painted eyes that seemed to demand answers he did not have. The pack needed a Luna. The elders reminded him of this nearly every week, their patience thinning with each failed introduction. A pack without a Luna was a pack without balance, they said, a pack vulnerable to rivals who watched from beyond the borders, waiting for any sign of weakness. But Cale had grown tired of parading strangers in front of his children, watching each one fail in some new and painful way, watching his sons grow more distrustful of the world with every disappointment. He did not want a Luna chosen for politics or bloodline. He wanted someone his children could trust. He was beginning to wonder, though he barely allowed himself the thought, whether such a person might be closer than anyone in the pack house realized. Down in the servants' quarters, Mira lay on her narrow cot that night, staring up at the low wooden ceiling, replaying the moment in her mind. The way Rue had pressed against her side, the way Ren's small hand had gripped the edge of her sleeve, as though letting go might mean losing something important. The single, whispered word that still echoed in her chest. Mama. She pressed her palm against her ribs, as if she could hold the feeling in place, and closed her eyes against the memory of another home, another set of small hands that used to reach for her the very same way, before the fire came and took it all. She had spent 2 years training herself not to feel things too deeply, not to hope for anything beyond a roof over her head and a wage that kept her fed. Hope, she had learned, only made loss sharper when it finally arrived. And yet, as she drifted toward an uneasy sleep, she could not stop the small, stubborn flicker of warmth that had settled somewhere behind her scarred and guarded heart, nor could she silence the quiet, dangerous thought that followed it. What if, just this once, she let herself hope again? Morning came to the Ashworth pack house with the sound of hooves on the gravel drive. A carriage bearing the crest of the Vance family rolled through the front gates, polished and gleaming, drawn by 4 matched black horses. Word had already spread through the halls that today's candidate was different from the others, a young woman named Elaine Vance, daughter of a powerful neighboring pack, known across the region for her composure and her sharp, calculating mind. Finn Callahan stood beside Cale on the front steps, watching the carriage approach with a wary expression. Her father is not a man who takes rejection well, Finn said quietly. If this one fails like the others, we may have more than gossip to worry about. Cale said nothing. He had grown weary of worrying about which noble family might take offense, weary of the endless calculations that came with choosing a Luna for political reasons rather than any reason of the heart. Still, he straightened his shoulders and put on the composed expression expected of an alpha as the carriage door opened and Elaine Vance stepped down, her dark green dress perfectly pressed, her chin lifted with practiced confidence. Alpha Ashworth, she said smoothly, extending a gloved hand. I have heard so much about your sons. I am certain we shall get along wonderfully. Cale inclined his head politely, though something in her tone, so certain, so rehearsed, made him uneasy in a way he could not quite explain. The introduction was arranged for later that afternoon, giving the household time to prepare. In the kitchens, Mira worked through her usual tasks, scrubbing pots and folding linens, trying not to think about the previous evening, trying not to wonder whether the twins would remember the stranger who had hummed them to sleep. She told herself it did not matter either way. Today, there was a proper candidate, a noblewoman with the right bloodline and the right manners, someone far better suited to calm two frightened children than a servant girl with a scarred face and a hidden past. And yet, as the afternoon wore on, she found herself listening for any sound from the nursery wing, any hint of how the introduction was going. She did not have to wait long to find out. The scream, when it came, was loud enough to carry through 2 floors of stone and wood. Mira nearly dropped the tray of tea she was carrying to the drawing room. Servants around her paused mid-task, exchanging knowing glances, none of them particularly surprised. Cale arrived at the nursery within moments, his heart hammering with a mixture of frustration and dread. Inside, he found Elaine Vance backed against the far wall, her perfectly composed expression shattered into something closer to fury, one side of her dress torn clean through at the hem. Ren stood a few feet away, chest heaving, small teeth bared, while Rue clung to the leg of the nursemaid's chair, eyes wide and glowing faintly gold. "They are beasts," Elaine snapped, straightening her torn dress with trembling, furious hands. "Absolute beasts. I have never been treated so poorly in all my life." "They are children," Cale said, his voice low and controlled, despite the anger simmering just beneath the surface. "Frightened children who have lost too much too young." Elaine's eyes narrowed, and for just a moment, something colder flickered across her face, gone before Cale could fully register it. "Perhaps," she said, smoothing her expression back into practiced calm, "they simply need a firmer hand. Children like this cannot be coddled forever, Alpha. Someday soon, they will need discipline, not indulgence." Cale felt his jaw tighten. There was something in the way she spoke about his sons, some undercurrent of disdain masked thinly beneath polite words, that struck him as deeply wrong. He had seen enough candidates now to recognize genuine attempts at kindness, however clumsy, and this was not one of them. "I think it is best you return to the guest quarters and rest," Cale said, keeping his tone even. "We will speak further this evening." Elaine's expression flickered again, irritation barely concealed, before she offered a tight, polite smile, and allowed a servant to escort her from the room. Once she was gone, Cale knelt beside his children, gently coaxing Ren's small fists to unclench, murmuring low, steady words, until the boy's shoulders finally relaxed. Rue crept out from behind the chair and pressed herself against her father's side, still trembling faintly. "I am sorry," Cale whispered, brushing a hand over his son's dark hair. "I am so sorry, both of you." He did not know, in that moment, exactly what he was apologizing for. Perhaps for the parade of strangers he kept bringing into their small, fragile world. Perhaps for a mother they would never remember, a gap in their lives he could not fill no matter how hard he tried. Perhaps simply for being unable, so far, to find the one person who might actually help. That evening, the pack elders gathered in the council chamber, their expressions grim as they discussed the day's events. An elder named Osric, the eldest among them, and the most vocal about tradition, struck his cane against the stone floor for emphasis. "This cannot continue, Alpha," Osric said. 5 candidates in as many weeks, each one failed. The Vance family will not take this rejection lightly, and neither will the other noble houses watching from the borders. A pack without a Luna is a pack seen as weak, and weakness invites challenge. "I am well aware of the risks," Cale said tightly, standing at the head of the table, "but I will not force my sons to accept a woman who sees them as beasts, to be disciplined rather than children to be loved." A murmur ran through the gathered elders, some sympathetic, others clearly frustrated by what they saw as their alpha's stubbornness. Finn, seated near the back of the chamber, cleared his throat. "If I may," Finn said carefully, "perhaps the issue is not the candidates themselves, but the approach. Every woman brought before Ren and Rue has been a stranger, someone with no prior connection to the children, expected to win their trust in a single afternoon. Perhaps what the twins need is time, familiarity, someone who has already earned a measure of their trust before ever being considered for such an important role. Kale's mind flashed, unbidden, to the image of Mira sitting on the nursery floor, humming softly, two small children settling peacefully against her sides. He said nothing of it aloud, not yet, but the thought lodged itself firmly in his mind and refused to leave. The council meeting continued late into the evening, circling the same tired arguments without any real resolution. By the time Kale finally left the chamber, the pack house had gone quiet. Most of the staff retired for the night, the halls lit only by the low glow of scattered lanterns. He found himself walking, without quite deciding to, toward the servants' quarters, a part of the pack house he rarely visited. He told himself he was simply restless, simply in need of air and space to think, but some quieter part of him knew exactly where his feet were leading him. He did not go so far as to knock on any door. He merely walked the corridor once, twice, his thoughts a tangled mess of duty and doubt, before finally turning back toward his own chambers, unwilling yet to examine too closely the strange pull he had begun to feel toward a servant girl whose name he had only just learned that morning from an offhand comment among the kitchen staff. Mira Hollis. The name settled in his mind like a stone dropped into still water, sending small ripples through thoughts he was not yet ready to untangle. In her narrow room below, Mira lay awake long after the rest of the household had gone quiet, staring up at the same low ceiling as the night before, her mind circling the same worries. She had heard, through the ever-present gossip of the kitchen staff, about the noble candidate's failed introduction, about the torn dress, and the furious retreat. She had felt, despite herself, a small flicker of something uncomfortably close to relief, followed immediately by guilt for feeling it at all. It was not her place to feel anything about the Alpha's search for a Luna. It was not her place to wonder whether the twins remembered her, whether they had cried for her the way they had cried the night before, whether anyone had thought to hum them a soft, wordless tune to help them find their way back to sleep. She turned onto her side, pulling the thin blanket higher, and tried to push the thoughts away. Tomorrow would bring more work, more scrubbing and folding and carrying, the same steady rhythm that had carried her through 2 years of quiet, unremarkable service. That was enough. That had to be enough. And yet, sleep proved slow to come, chased away by the persistent, unwelcome memory of 2 small hands gripping her sleeve, and one soft, broken whisper that she could not quite manage to forget. A week passed, and the pack house settled into an uneasy quiet. No new candidates arrived, giving Kale a brief reprieve from the endless parade of failed introductions, though he knew Osric and the other elders would not allow the pause to last long. In the meantime, life in the pack house continued its familiar rhythm, servants moving through their duties, the twins growing a little steadier each day under the careful watch of their nursemaid. Mira had convinced herself, over the course of that week, that the strange evening in the nursery had been nothing more than an unusual coincidence, a moment born of exhaustion and lucky timing. She returned to her usual duties, careful to avoid the family wing altogether, telling herself it was simply easier that way. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. On a cold evening near the end of the week, a sudden fever swept through several members of the nursery staff, leaving the head nursemaid bedridden and 2 other assistants too weak to work. Greta, scrambling to cover the sudden shortage of hands, found herself short on options as the dinner hour approached, and the twins still needed to be fed and settled for the night. "You," Greta said, catching sight of Mira carrying a stack of folded towels down the hallway. "You will take the evening meal up to the nursery. I have no one else free, and I will not have those children going hungry, because half my staff decided to fall ill at once." Mira's stomach twisted, with a mixture of nervousness and something she refused to name as excitement. "Of course," she said quietly, adjusting her grip on the tray Greta thrust into her hands, careful to keep her expression neutral, despite the sudden thrum of her pulse. She climbed the servant stairs slowly, balancing the tray of warm food, rehearsing in her mind the simple, professional manner she intended to keep. Deliver the meal, assist if needed, leave promptly, nothing more. When she reached the nursery, she found the twins sitting at their small table, restless and fussy, refusing the attempts of a junior maid to coax them into eating. The moment Mira stepped through the doorway, both children went still, their heads turning in unison toward her, small faces breaking into wide, delighted smiles. "Mira," Ren said, the first time she had heard either of them speak her name, and something in her chest cracked open despite every effort she had made to keep it sealed. Rue slid down from her chair and toddled across the room, wrapping both arms around Mira's legs with a fierce, joyful hug that nearly knocked the tray from her hands. The junior maid, clearly relieved to be freed from a losing battle, stepped back with wide eyes. "They have been asking for you," the maid whispered, sounding half amazed and half unsettled. "All week, I did not know what to tell them." Mira knelt carefully, setting the tray aside, and let Rue climb fully into her lap, while Ren pressed close against her side. "I am sorry I was not here sooner," she murmured, brushing a hand over Rue's soft hair. "But I am here now. Shall we eat together?" The twins, who had refused every spoonful offered to them moments before, ate eagerly, once Mira settled beside them, patiently coaxing bites between small bursts of chatter and laughter. She found herself smiling, truly smiling, for the first time in longer than she could remember, caught up in the simple, easy warmth of their company. She did not notice at first the figure standing quietly in the doorway, watching the scene unfold with an expression caught somewhere between wonder and quiet ache. Cale had come to check on his sons after hearing about the sudden staff shortage, expecting to find them fussing and difficult, as they so often were with anyone new. Instead, he found them laughing, eating happily, curled contentedly around the same servant girl he had not been able to stop thinking about for the better part of a week. He watched for a long moment before finally stepping into the room, and Mira startled at the sound of his footsteps, quickly rising and lowering her eyes in the proper, deferential manner expected of household staff. "Alpha," she said, her voice slightly unsteady. "Forgive me. I was only asked to bring the evening meal, given the shortage of staff. I did not intend to overstep." "You are not overstepping," Cale said, his voice quieter and gentler than she expected. "You are the first person in weeks who has managed to get either of them to eat a full meal without protest." Mira did not know how to respond to that, so she said nothing at all, keeping her gaze respectfully lowered, while Ren tugged insistently at her sleeve, wanting her attention back on him rather than on the tall figure of his father standing near the door. Cale crossed the room slowly and knelt beside his children, watching the easy way they leaned into Mira's presence, the complete absence of fear or wariness that had defined every other interaction they'd had with adults outside their immediate family since their mother's passing. "How did you manage this?" he asked quietly, genuine curiosity replacing the formal distance in his tone. "Every candidate we have brought before them, every noblewoman trained in the proper etiquette of introducing herself to a Luna's future children, has failed within minutes. And yet they took to you almost instantly." Mira hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I do not think they need proper etiquette, Alpha," she said slowly. "I think they need patience, and perhaps someone who does not expect anything from them in return." Something in Cale's expression shifted at those words, a flicker of understanding crossing his features. He looked down at his children, so at ease, so unguarded, and then back up at the young woman kneeling beside them, her scarred jaw slightly turned away, as though from habit rather than shame. "What is your name?" he asked, though he already knew the answer, some part of him wanting to hear her say it herself. "Mira Hollis, Alpha," she said quietly. "Mira," he repeated, testing the name, letting it settle into the room, alongside the soft sounds of his children's contented chatter. "Thank you, Mira, for tonight, and for whatever it is you managed to do that no one else could." She flushed slightly beneath the compliment, unused to praise of any kind, and quickly busied herself gathering the empty dishes to avoid meeting his gaze any longer than necessary. "It was no trouble, Alpha. I am glad they ate well." Cale watched her work for a long moment before rising to his feet. "The nursery staff will likely remain short-handed for several more days," he said, his tone carefully casual, though something deliberate lingered beneath the words. "Would you be willing to continue helping until they recover?" Mira's heart stumbled at the question, torn between the pull of two small hands still clinging to her skirt and the deep, ingrained caution that had kept her safe and unnoticed for 2 long years. She glanced down at Ren and Rue, both watching her with wide, hopeful eyes, and found she could not bring herself to refuse. "Of course, Alpha," she said softly, "whatever the household needs." Over the following days, Mira found herself spending more and more time in the nursery, first out of necessity, then simply because the twins refused to settle for anyone else. She read to them in the evenings, her voice soft and steady, working her way through worn storybooks with pictures faded from years of small, curious fingers. She taught them simple songs, the kind she remembered from her own childhood, watching their small faces light up with delight each time they managed to sing along. Slowly, carefully, something shifted in the pack house. The whispers among the staff changed from gossip about failed noble candidates to quiet, curious murmurs about the servant girl who had somehow succeeded where dozens of carefully chosen women had failed. Greta, though she would never admit it aloud, began assigning Mira to the nursery duties as a matter of course, no longer questioning the arrangement. And Cale, more often than he would have expected, found reasons to visit the nursery in the evenings, drawn by the sound of his children's genuine laughter, a sound the pack house had not heard nearly often enough in the 2 years since Alira's passing. He told himself he was simply checking on his sons. He did not yet let himself examine too closely the way his gaze lingered on Mira as she read to them, the way something in his chest eased whenever he watched her patient, steady care. Mira, for her part, tried desperately not to hope for anything beyond the present moment, tried to remind herself daily that this arrangement was temporary, born of necessity rather than any lasting change in her circumstances. And yet, each night, as she tucked the twins into their small beds and pressed a gentle hand to each of their foreheads, she found the careful walls she had built around her heart growing thinner and thinner, no matter how hard she tried to hold them in place. She did not yet know that beneath the surface of this fragile, growing peace, old dangers were beginning to stir, dangers rooted in a past she had spent 2 years trying to outrun, dangers that would soon find their way back to her door, no matter how carefully she had hidden. For now, though, in the quiet warmth of the nursery each evening, surrounded by the soft sound of 2 small children's breathing, and the steady, watchful presence of a father who was beginning to see her in a way no one had in a very long time, Mira allowed herself, just a little, to feel something dangerously close to happiness. The fire came back to her that night, the way it always did when her guard slipped too far down. Mira woke with a gasp, her chest heaving, the taste of smoke still clinging to the back of her throat, though no fire burned anywhere near her small room. She pressed a trembling hand against her scarred jaw, an old, unconscious habit, and waited for her racing heart to slow, for the darkness around her to settle back into the familiar shapes of her narrow bed and worn dresser, rather than the collapsing beams of a burning house. It had been 3 years since the fire took her family, 3 years since she had stood outside a house wrapped in flames, screaming for her mother, her father, her younger brother, while neighbors held her back from running inside after them. 3 years since she had watched everything she knew turn to ash and smoke, and 3 years since the whispers began, cruel and cutting, that she herself had somehow been responsible. She had not started that fire. She knew this with absolute certainty, though certainty had done little to protect her from the suspicion that followed her afterward, suspicion planted and nurtured by a family with far more power and influence than her own, a family who had wanted the land beneath her childhood home for reasons she had only partially understood at the time. She had fled before the accusations could harden into anything official, taking nothing but a small bag of belongings and the scar along her jaw where a falling ember had caught her as she tried, uselessly, to run back into the flames. She had wandered for months before finding her way to the Ashworth Packlands, drawn by rumors of an alpha known for fairness and a household always in need of extra hands. She had given a false surname on her first day, just to be safe, and had spent every day since trying to become as invisible as possible, terrified that someone from her past might one day recognize her and drag the old accusations back into the light. She rose from her cot before dawn, as she always did after these dreams, unable to bear the thought of lying still with her memories any longer. She dressed quietly and made her way down to the kitchens, hoping the familiar rhythm of early morning chores might chase the last lingering images of smoke and flame from her mind. Greta was already awake, kneading dough at the long wooden table, and glanced up as Mira entered. Rough night? The older woman asked, her tone gruffer than usual, but not entirely unkind. Something like that, Mira murmured, reaching for an apron. Greta studied her for a moment longer than necessary, her sharp eyes lingering on the faint shadows beneath Mira's eyes. You know, she said slowly, for 2 years, you have kept yourself so quiet in this house that half the staff barely knew your name. And now suddenly the Alpha's own children cannot stop asking for you, and the Alpha himself finds reasons to wander the nursery hall most evenings. She paused, letting the words settle. That sort of attention draws eyes, girl, not all of them kind. Mira's hands stilled over the apron strings. I have not asked for any of this, she said quietly. I only wanted to help settle the children when their nursemaid fell ill. I know that, Greta said, her voice softening slightly. But knowing it and having others believe it are two very different things. Just be careful. Households like this one are full of people who notice when a servant girl rises above her expected place, and not all of them wish her well for it. Mira nodded, tucking the warning away alongside all her other carefully guarded fears, and threw herself into the morning's work with renewed determination, hoping the familiar ache in her arms and back might crowd out the unease still coiled in her chest. She did not know, as she scrubbed and swept and carried trays throughout that long day, that her quiet warning from Greta had come far too late. Word of the servant girl who had tamed the Alpha's unruly twins had already begun to travel beyond the walls of the pack house, carried along the usual channels of gossip that flowed between neighboring packs whenever anything unusual occurred within a prominent household. A traveling merchant, passing through on his usual route, had heard the story from a stable hand and repeated it, embellished slightly, at his next stop several miles away. From there, the tale spread further still, gathering small distortions with each retelling, until it reached, eventually, the grand estate of the Vance family. Elaine Vance received the news with narrowed eyes and a slowly tightening jaw, sitting in her father's study, as the household steward relayed the rumor in careful, measured tones. A servant girl, Elaine repeated flatly. You are telling me that after I traveled to that pack house, dressed and prepared according to every proper tradition, humiliated in front of the entire household by those feral little beasts, a common servant girl has somehow succeeded where I failed? That is the rumor circulating, my lady, the steward said carefully. Though rumors, of course, often grow larger than the truth. Elaine rose from her seat and crossed to the window, staring out over the manicured grounds of her family's estate, her mind already turning over the implications of this unexpected news. She had not particularly wanted to marry Cale Ashworth for any reason of the heart. The match had been arranged, primarily, for the political and financial advantages it would bring her family, advantages her father had made clear he expected her to secure, regardless of her personal feelings on the matter. Her failure, and the very public nature of it, torn dress and all, had already begun to damage her standing among the other noble families, whispers following her at every gathering since her return. She could not afford, she realized, to have her humiliation compounded further by news that a servant girl had accomplished what she could not. She turned back to the steward, her expression carefully composed once more. Find out everything you can about this girl, she said coolly. Her name, her history, where she came from before entering Ashworth's service. Everything. The steward bowed and departed to carry out her instructions, leaving Elaine alone with her thoughts and a slowly hardening determination to reclaim what she considered rightfully hers, regardless of what, or who, stood in her way. Back at the pack house, unaware of the quiet storm beginning to gather at the edges of her fragile new happiness, Mira spent her afternoon in the nursery, as she had every day that week, reading to the twins while they sprawled comfortably across a soft rug near the window, sunlight warming the room around them. Again, Rue insisted, tugging at the edge of the storybook as Mira reached its final page. Again, Mira, again. Mira laughed softly, closing the book despite the protest. We have read this one 3 times already, little one. Perhaps tomorrow we try a new story instead? Ren, curled against her other side, yawned widely and rubbed at his eyes, clearly closer to sleep than his sister despite her continued energy. Mira gathered him gently into her lap, humming the same soft, wordless tune that had first calmed them weeks earlier, and within minutes, both children had drifted into a peaceful afternoon nap, curled comfortably against her. She sat quietly for a long while afterward, simply watching them sleep, her fingers absently smoothing Ren's dark hair away from his forehead. It struck her, in that stillness, how thoroughly she had let her guard down over these past weeks, how easily these two small children had slipped past every careful wall she had built to protect herself from exactly this kind of attachment. It frightened her, if she was honest with herself. She had lost a family once already, suddenly and completely, and some deep, wounded part of her still expected every good thing in her life to be temporary, to be taken away the moment she allowed herself to believe it might last. The door opened quietly, and she looked up to find Cale standing in the doorway, his expression soft as he took in the sight of his sleeping children curled against her. "They wear themselves out quickly these days," he said quietly, careful not to wake them as he crossed the room and knelt beside the rug. "I do not think I have seen them nap this soundly in months." "They are simply tired from all the excitement," Mira said, keeping her voice equally low. "Rue especially. She has more energy than the rest of the household combined." Cale smiled faintly at that, watching his daughter's peaceful, sleeping face for a long moment, before his gaze shifted to Mira. "May I ask you something?" he said carefully. Mira's stomach tightened slightly at the question, though she nodded regardless. "Of course, Alpha. Where did you learn to care for children this way?" he asked. "It is not something typically taught among household staff, and yet you seem to understand exactly what they need, almost instinctively." Mira's fingers stilled against Ren's hair, and for a long moment she said nothing at all, caught between the instinct to deflect the question entirely and a quiet, unfamiliar urge to be honest with someone for once, even if only partially. "I had younger siblings, once," she said finally, her voice quieter than before. "A brother, and later a small sister. I helped raise them, before circumstances changed." Cale did not press further, sensing the careful edges around her words, the deliberate way she avoided elaborating on exactly what circumstances she meant. He simply nodded, filing the small piece of information away alongside the growing collection of quiet mysteries surrounding the woman kneeling across from him. "I am sorry," he said gently, "for whatever happened to change that." Mira met his gaze briefly, surprised by the genuine warmth in his expression, before looking back down at the sleeping children between them. "Thank you," she murmured. "It was a long time ago." They sat together in comfortable silence after that, the afternoon light shifting slowly across the nursery floor, neither one quite ready to break the fragile, easy peace that had settled over the room. Neither of them noticed, in that quiet moment, the careful, watchful eyes of a household steward passing by the partially open door, eyes that lingered a moment too long before continuing on, carrying fresh gossip toward ears far less friendly than those already within the packhouse walls. The council chamber felt colder than usual that morning, though no windows had been left open, and the hearth burned steadily at one end of the long stone room. Cale sat at the head of the table, watching the elders file in one by one, their expressions ranging from mild curiosity to open disapproval, and he already suspected what had drawn them together on such short notice. Osric wasted no time once the doors were closed. "Alpha, we have heard troubling reports," he said, striking his cane against the floor for emphasis, a habit that had grown more frequent with his frustration in recent weeks. "Reports that a servant girl has been spending considerable time alone with your children, that she has, in fact, been left largely unsupervised in the nursery on multiple occasions." "Her name is Mira Hollis," Cale said evenly, refusing to let the elder's tone provoke him. "She has been assisting with the twins, while the regular nursery staff recovers from illness. There is nothing improper about the arrangement." "Improper or not," another elder cut in, a stern woman named Fenna, who had served on the council since before Cale's own father held the Alpha title. "It raises questions we cannot simply ignore. This girl has no noble bloodline, no family connections, no history known to this council beyond whatever she chose to share upon entering service, and yet she has somehow gained unprecedented access to the Alpha's own children, children who are meant to inherit leadership of this entire pack." Cale felt his patience thinning, though he kept his voice carefully controlled. "She has gained their trust," he said. something none of the carefully selected noble candidates managed to achieve, despite every advantage of bloodline and training you speak so highly of. The chamber fell into an uneasy silence at that, several of the elders exchanging glances, none quite willing to argue directly against the truth of his words, though clearly unhappy with the direction the conversation had taken. Finn, seated near the back as always, watched his friend carefully, recognizing the familiar set of Cale's jaw that usually preceded a decision the elders would not like. "I understand your concerns," Cale continued, softening his tone slightly, though the firmness beneath it did not waver. "But I will not dismiss the one person who has managed to bring genuine peace to my children simply because her background does not fit the expectations of this council. If anything, her presence has shown me clearly what this search has been missing all along." Osric's expression darkened further. "Are you suggesting, Alpha, that you intend to consider a servant girl as a candidate for Luna?" The question landed heavily in the chamber, and Cale found himself hesitating, surprised by his own reluctance to immediately deny it. He had not consciously allowed himself to consider such a possibility before this exact moment, though something in him had clearly been circling closer to the idea for weeks without his full acknowledgement. "I have made no such decision," he said finally, choosing his words with care. "But I will also not close the door on any possibility, simply because it fails to align with tradition. This pack needs a Luna who can care for its future heirs, not merely one who satisfies expectations of bloodline and status." The council chamber erupted into a low murmur of disagreement and reluctant consideration, voices overlapping as the elders debated the unprecedented notion among themselves. Cale let the discussion continue for a while, watching the reactions carefully, before finally raising a hand for silence. "This conversation is not yet finished," he said, "but it is finished for today. I have heard your concerns, and I will consider them carefully. In the meantime, Mira Hollis will continue assisting with my children for as long as they need her, regardless of any objections raised in this chamber." He rose from his seat, signaling the end of the meeting, and left the chamber before further arguments could be raised, though he could feel the weight of disapproving eyes following him all the way to the door. Finn caught up with him in the hallway outside, matching his long strides easily after years of friendship and countless similar walks away from difficult council meetings. "That went about as well as I expected," Finn said dryly. "Which is to say, not well at all," Cale replied, a faint, tired smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, despite the tension still coiled in his shoulders. "You know they will not let this go easily," Finn said, his tone growing more serious. "Osric especially. He has spent decades upholding tradition in this pack, and the idea of a servant girl rising to Luna will strike him as a direct challenge to everything he believes in." "I am aware," Cale said quietly. "But I find, more and more, that I care less about satisfying Osric's traditions and more about giving my children the chance at genuine happiness. They have lost enough already. I will not deny them the one source of comfort they have finally found, simply to appease a council more concerned with bloodlines than with actual care." Finn studied his friend for a long moment, recognizing something new in his expression, a conviction that had not been present during the earlier, more resigned weeks of failed candidate introductions. "You care for her," Finn said, not quite a question. Cale did not answer immediately, his gaze drifting toward the direction of the nursery wing, though he could not yet see it from where they stood. "I do not know what I feel yet," he admitted finally, "but I know that watching her with my children these past weeks has shown me something I had stopped believing was possible. A version of this pack house filled with genuine warmth again, rather than simply duty and grief." Finn said nothing further, merely clapping a steady hand against his friend's shoulder before the two continued down the hallway together, leaving the tense atmosphere of the council chamber behind them. Meanwhile, in the servants' quarters, word of the council meeting had already begun circulating among the staff, carried swiftly along the usual channels of household gossip. Mira heard fragments of it while helping prepare the midday meal, snatches of conversation about the Alpha defending her before the elders, about whispered talk of Luna candidacy, about growing tension between tradition and whatever unprecedented path Cale seemed determined to consider. Her hands trembled slightly as she worked, torn between a small, dangerous flicker of hope and a much larger, more familiar wave of fear. She had spent years training herself to remain unnoticed, precisely because attention, in her experience, rarely led anywhere good. And now here she was, apparently the subject of council debates among the pack's most powerful and traditional elders, her name spoken aloud in rooms she would never be permitted to enter herself. "You have heard, then," Greta said, appearing at her side with a knowing look, though her tone carried more concern than judgment this time. "The whole household is talking of nothing else." "I did not ask for this," Mira said again, the same quiet protest she had offered days earlier, though it felt increasingly hollow given how far the situation had already progressed beyond her control. "I believe you," Greta said, surprising her. "But belief and reality are different things, girl. Whatever is happening between you and the Alpha, whether you intended it or not, it has consequences now. Powerful people will not simply let this pass without consequence, particularly not families like the Vances, who have already lost face once in this matter." Mira's stomach twisted uncomfortably at the mention of the Vance name, an unease she could not quite explain settling over her, though she pushed the feeling aside as simple nervousness rather than any deeper premonition. She finished her tasks that afternoon in a distracted haze, her mind circling endlessly around the conversation she had overheard, the strange new reality unfolding around her that she had never asked for and did not fully know how to navigate. When evening finally arrived and she made her way to the nursery for the twins' bedtime routine, she found herself studying Cale more carefully than usual as he stopped by to say goodnight to his children, searching his expression for some hint of what exactly had transpired in that council chamber, and what it might mean for the fragile, uncertain place she had somehow carved out for herself within these walls. "You seem distracted tonight," Cale observed quietly, once the twins had finally settled into sleep and they stood together near the nursery door. "I heard about the council meeting," Mira admitted, deciding honesty was simpler than pretending ignorance. "I did not mean to cause difficulty for you, Alpha. If my presence here creates problems with the elders, I understand if it would be best for me to step back." Cale's expression softened, and he shook his head firmly. "You have caused no difficulty that was not already present within this council, long before you arrived," he said. "The only difficulty you have caused is forcing certain traditions to be questioned, which, in my opinion, is long overdue." Mira did not know how to respond to that. Her heart caught somewhere between gratitude and lingering apprehension, and she simply nodded, murmuring a quiet good night, before slipping away toward the servants' stairs, leaving Cale standing alone in the darkened hallway, his thoughts far from settled, despite the confidence he had projected in the council chamber. Neither of them yet knew how quickly the quiet tension building around them would erupt into something far more dangerous, nor how soon the whispered word that had first passed Rue's small lips weeks earlier would echo through the entire packhouse, forcing every careful secret and hidden truth into the unforgiving light. Despite the council's disapproval, Cale made his decision within the week, arriving at it with a clarity that surprised even himself. He summoned Mira to his study one evening, after the twins had been settled for the night, and watched her step through the door with obvious nervousness, her hands folded tightly in front of her apron. "Alpha," she said carefully, "you asked to see me?" "Sit, please," Cale said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. She hesitated only briefly before lowering herself into it, perched on the edge, as though ready to rise and flee at the first sign of trouble. Cale studied her for a long moment, choosing his words with unusual care. "I have spent the past several weeks watching my children flourish under your care, in a way I had genuinely begun to believe was impossible," he said finally. "I would like to make your role here more formal. Rather than assisting only when the regular staff falls ill, I would like you to take on the ongoing responsibility of caring for Ren and Rue, with appropriate compensation and standing within the household to match." Mira blinked, caught off guard by the directness of the offer. "Alpha, I am only a servant," she said quietly. "Surely there are others better suited to such a position, women with proper training in early childhood care." "There are women with proper training," Cale agreed. "None of them have managed what you have managed, without any training at all beyond whatever instinct and experience you carry from your own past. I do not care about proper training nearly as much as I care about my children's genuine well-being, and you have proven, beyond any doubt, that you understand what they need better than anyone else in this household." Mira sat quietly for a long moment, processing the offer, torn between the practical relief of steadier work and the deeper, more complicated feelings that had been growing inside her these past weeks. Feelings she had tried very hard not to examine too closely. "I accept," she said finally, her voice soft but steady. "Thank you, Alpha, for trusting me with something so important." Kale's expression eased into something warmer at her acceptance. A small, genuine smile that transformed his usually composed features. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for giving my children something I could not find anywhere else." The arrangement, once made official, brought a new rhythm to the pack house. Mira moved from her narrow room in the servants' quarters to a slightly larger room closer to the nursery, still simple and unadorned, but a clear improvement over her previous accommodations. She spent her days fully immersed in the twins' care, teaching them small lessons, tending to their meals and rest, filling their days with the kind of steady, patient attention they had been missing for so long. Word of the arrangement spread quickly through the pack, as such things always did, and while some among the staff continued their quiet gossip, most had grown genuinely fond of watching the twins laugh and play with an openness they had rarely displayed before. Even Greta, though she would never fully admit it aloud, found herself softening toward the arrangement, occasionally slipping Mira an extra pastry or a kind word during the busy morning hours. It was nearly 3 weeks into this new routine when the next candidate arrived, sent by a noble family eager to secure the alliance the Vance family had failed to claim. Her name was Odette, a poised young woman with pale blonde hair and an easy, practiced smile, confident in her ability to succeed where so many others had failed. Kale, though he had grown increasingly uncertain about the entire candidate process, could not fully dismiss the council's ongoing pressure, and agreed to one final formal introduction, if only to satisfy the elders' insistence that every proper avenue be explored before any unconventional decisions were made regarding the pack's future Luna. The introduction was arranged for a bright afternoon in the garden, a setting meant to feel relaxed and natural, rather than the formal tension of the great hall. Odette arrived dressed simply but elegantly, clearly having studied the reports of previous candidates' failures and adjusted her approach accordingly. Mira, though she had not been formally invited to attend, found herself standing at the edge of the garden with the twins, having been asked by Kale himself to bring them for the introduction, since they responded so poorly to unfamiliar settings without her steady presence nearby. "This is Miss Odette," Kale said gently, kneeling beside his children as the young woman approached with careful, measured steps. "She has come to meet you both." Odette knelt as well, keeping a respectful distance, her smile warm and unhurried. "Hello, Ren. Hello, Rue," she said softly, her voice pitched low and gentle, clearly having learned from the mistakes of previous candidates, who had approached too quickly, too eagerly. "I have heard you both love stories. Perhaps you might tell me your favorite one sometime." For a long, tense moment, the twins simply stared at her, and Mira held her breath, hoping desperately, and somewhat guiltily, that this candidate might succeed where the others had failed, that perhaps her children might finally find the stability the entire household so badly needed. Ren, cautiously, took a small step forward, and Odette's smile widened with quiet triumph. But before he could take another step, Rue tugged sharply at Mira's skirt, her small face crumpling with sudden distress, and within seconds, both twins had abandoned any interest in the newcomer entirely, turning instead to bury themselves against Mira's legs, small hands gripping fistfuls of her apron. "Mama," Rue said clearly, loudly enough for everyone in the garden to hear, the word ringing out across the quiet afternoon air with startling clarity. The garden fell utterly silent. Odette's carefully composed smile faltered, her eyes darting between the twins and the servant girl they clung to so desperately, confusion, and something sharper flickering across her expression. Kale went very still, his gaze fixed on his daughter's small, determined face, watching as Ren, a moment later, echoed the same word in a quieter, more hesitant voice. "Mama," he said, reaching up to take Mira's free hand. Mira felt her face flush deeply, mortification and something achingly tender warring within her chest as every eye in the garden turned toward her. "I am sorry," she stammered, kneeling quickly to address the children directly, rather than meet anyone's gaze. "Sweethearts, I am not your mama. You know this. Miss Odette has come especially to meet you both. But the twins would not be moved, clinging tighter, Rue actually beginning to cry when Mira attempted to gently disentangle herself, and within moments, it became clear that any further attempt at introduction would only end in more distress for everyone involved. Perhaps, Cale said carefully, breaking the heavy silence, we should try again another time, when they are feeling less unsettled. Odette rose slowly, her composed exterior cracking just slightly at the edges, though she recovered quickly, offering a polite, if strained, smile. Of course, Alpha, she said. Children can be unpredictable. I understand entirely. But as she turned to leave the garden, Mira caught the brief, sharp look Odette cast in her direction, a look that held none of the polite understanding her words had suggested, a look instead filled with cold calculation and something closer to resentment. Once the garden had emptied of onlookers, leaving only Cale, Mira, and the still clinging twins, an uncomfortable silence settled between the two adults. Mira finally managed to coax the children into releasing their grip, though both still pressed close against her sides, clearly unwilling to move any further away. I am so sorry, Alpha, Mira said again, her voice tight with embarrassment. I did not mean for this to happen. I never encouraged them to call me that, I promise you. I know, Cale said quietly, and something in his tone made her look up, surprised by the lack of anger or disappointment she had expected to find. Instead, his expression held something far more complicated, tender, and troubled all at once. They see what is true, he said finally, even if the rest of us have been too slow or too afraid to say it aloud. Mira's breath caught at his words, uncertain exactly what he meant, though the way he looked at her in that moment sent a rush of warmth through her chest that she immediately tried to suppress, reminding herself firmly of the vast gulf that still separated a servant girl from an alpha, regardless of what two small children might instinctively believe. I should take them inside, she said softly, gathering the twins close. They have had quite an eventful afternoon. Cale nodded, though he did not move immediately to let her pass, his gaze lingering on her face for a long moment, before he finally stepped aside. Mira, he said, just as she began to walk past him. She paused, glancing back. Thank you, he said simply, for everything you continue to give them, even when it is not asked of you. She offered a small, uncertain smile before continuing on toward the pack house, the twins' small hands still clutched tightly in her own, unaware that behind her, Odette had paused just beyond the garden gate, watching the entire exchange with narrowed eyes and a mind already turning toward calculated, quiet revenge. By the following morning, the story of what happened in the garden had spread through the entire pack house, growing more dramatic with each retelling, until the servants whispered of it, as though the twins had declared Mira their mother before the assembled nobility of 3 neighboring packs, rather than a single quiet afternoon gathering. Mira kept to the nursery as much as possible, hoping to let the gossip fade naturally, though she could feel the weight of curious and, in some cases, distinctly unfriendly glances following her whenever she ventured beyond its walls. Odette, meanwhile, had not returned home quietly as expected. Instead, she had sent word to her family, requesting a delay in her formal withdrawal from consideration, citing a need to properly understand what she called irregularities within the Ashworth household. Her true intentions, however, lay elsewhere entirely. She arranged, through careful and discreet correspondence, a meeting with Elaine Vance, the 2 women united by a shared humiliation and an equally shared determination to see it avenged. A servant girl, Odette said with quiet fury, seated across from Elaine in a private parlor several miles from the Ashworth lands. The children called her Mama, in front of the entire garden, in front of me, as though I were nothing more than an unwelcome intrusion. I experienced much the same disrespect, Elaine said coolly, though a sharp gleam had entered her eyes at Odette's news. I have already begun looking into her background. It seems our mysterious servant girl is not entirely what she claims to be. She withdrew a folded paper from within her sleeve and passed it across the table. Odette scanned the contents quickly, her eyebrows rising with interest as she read. A fire, Odette murmured. Suspicious circumstances. An entire family lost. and the sole survivor vanishing shortly afterward, under a different name. This is quite the discovery. My father's investigators are thorough, Elaine said, a cold satisfaction settling into her expression. It seems Mira Hollis is not her true name at all, and the fire that gave her that scar was not the simple accident she has allowed the Ashworth household to assume. There were accusations, once, that she herself may have been responsible. Odette's expression sharpened with interest. Do we know if those accusations held any truth? It hardly matters, Elaine said with a thin smile. What matters is that the accusation exists, documented and verifiable, and that Alpha Ashworth has allowed this woman unsupervised access to his own children without the slightest awareness of her true history. Imagine how the Pack Council would react to learn that the servant girl now practically running the nursery may have once been suspected of setting a fire that killed her entire family. The two women spent the remainder of the afternoon refining their plan, deciding the most effective way to bring this information before the Pack Council without revealing their own hand too obviously in its discovery. They settled, eventually, on an anonymous letter, delivered discreetly to Elder Osric, whose existing suspicion of Mira's unconventional rise within the household made him the perfect vessel for spreading the damaging revelation. 3 days later, Osric requested an emergency council session, his expression grim as he laid the anonymous letter upon the long table before the assembled elders. I did not wish to believe such a claim without further investigation, Osric said gravely, but the details provided proved disturbingly easy to verify through discreet inquiry. The woman known to this household as Mira Hollis was born under an entirely different name. Her true family perished in a house fire 3 years past, under circumstances that led local authorities to suspect she herself may have caused it, likely in some dispute over inherited land. The chamber erupted into shocked murmurs, several elders exchanging alarmed glances, while Fenna's expression hardened with immediate, righteous anger. And this is the woman our Alpha has placed in sole charge of his children, she said sharply. A woman potentially responsible for the death of her own family, now trusted with the lives of our future heirs. Cale, seated at the head of the table, felt something cold settle in his stomach, even as every instinct rebelled against the accusation. This is nothing more than an anonymous letter, he said, keeping his voice carefully level despite the alarm building within him. We do not know its source, nor its accuracy. I will not condemn Mira based on unverified gossip delivered through such questionable means. Questionable means or not, Osric said firmly, the details are specific enough to warrant serious concern. I move that the woman be removed from her position immediately, pending a full investigation into the truth of these claims. The chamber's murmurs grew louder, several elders nodding in agreement with Osric's proposal, while Cale felt the ground shifting beneath him in a way he had not anticipated. The fragile arrangement he had fought so hard to establish, suddenly threatened by shadows from a past he knew almost nothing about. I will speak with her myself, Cale said finally, his tone leaving no room for argument. Before any decision is made regarding her position, she deserves the chance to explain the truth of her circumstances, rather than being judged solely on the word of an anonymous accuser. The council reluctantly agreed to grant him this concession, though the tension in the chamber remained thick as the meeting concluded, several elders casting doubtful, troubled glances his way, as he left to seek out the young woman whose carefully guarded secrets had just been thrown into the harsh light of public scrutiny. He found Mira in the nursery, reading quietly to the twins as the late afternoon sun slanted through the windows, and something in his expression must have betrayed the seriousness of what had just occurred, because she rose immediately, her face paling with dawning apprehension. Alpha, she said carefully, what has happened? Can we speak privately? He asked, glancing toward the nursemaid who had recently returned to her duties and now sat nearby, ready to watch the children in Mira's absence. Mira followed him out into the hallway, her heart pounding with a familiar, dreaded certainty that the fragile peace she had built here was about to shatter completely. Please, she said softly, once the nursery door had closed behind them, just tell me. Cale studied her face carefully before speaking, searching for any sign of guilt or deception, finding only fear and a kind of resigned exhaustion, as though she had long expected this exact moment to eventually arrive. The council received an anonymous letter, he said quietly, claiming that you were once suspected of setting a fire that killed your family 3 years ago, under a different name. Mira's face went completely white, and for a long, terrible moment, she said nothing at all, her silence somehow more damning than any denial could have been, though Cale found himself desperately hoping it meant something else entirely, that she was simply too shocked to speak rather than too guilty. "Mira," he said gently, "tell me the truth. Whatever it is, I need to hear it from you directly." She lifted her gaze to meet his, and he saw, clearly now, the deep well of old pain hidden behind her carefully composed exterior, pain she had clearly carried alone for far too long. "It is true," she said quietly, "that my family died in a fire 3 years ago. It is true that some people believed I was responsible." She paused, drawing a shaking breath before continuing. "But I did not set that fire, Alpha. I would never have harmed my own family. The people who accused me wanted the land beneath our home, and my family's tragedy became a convenient excuse to force me from my rightful inheritance." Cale studied her carefully, searching for any hint of deception in her expression, finding instead only raw, exposed honesty, the kind that came from someone who had carried an unjust burden alone for far too long. "Why did you never tell me this?" he asked, though not unkindly. "Because I was afraid," Mira admitted, her voice breaking slightly, "afraid that even without proof, the accusation alone would be enough to end everything I have managed to build here. Afraid that you would look at me exactly the way you might be looking at me right now." "I do not believe you capable of such a thing," Cale said firmly, surprising her with the immediate certainty in his voice. "I have watched you with my children for weeks now, Mira. I have seen the gentleness in you, the patience, the genuine care you show them without any expectation of reward. Whatever happened 3 years ago, I do not believe for a single moment that you were responsible for it." Relief and disbelief warred across her features, tears gathering unbidden in her eyes at the unexpected, unwavering support in his words. "The council will not be so easily convinced," she whispered. "Then I will convince them," Cale said, his jaw set with quiet, fierce determination. "But first, I need to know everything, Mira. Every detail of what truly happened that night, and who exactly stood to gain from your family's tragedy. If someone worked to frame you 3 years ago, and has now revealed themselves through this anonymous letter, I intend to find out exactly who they are, and I intend to make certain the truth, the full truth, finally comes to light." They sat together in Cale's private study, late into the evening, the twins already settled for the night under the nursemaid's care, while Mira finally allowed herself to speak the full truth of what had happened 3 years earlier, details she had never shared with another living soul since arriving at the Ashworth Packlands. "My family lived on a small piece of land bordering the Doyle territory," she began, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her voice steady despite the difficulty of the memory. "My father had inherited it from his own father, a modest but fertile stretch of ground that the Doyle family had wanted for generations, believing it rightfully belonged to their own lineage due to some old, disputed boundary line." Cale listened silently, giving her the space to continue at her own pace. "They approached my father many times over the years, offering to purchase the land, always for far less than its true worth. He refused every time, wanting to preserve what little inheritance he had to pass down to my brother and me." She paused, her jaw tightening slightly. "The fire happened on a night when my father had, once again, firmly refused their latest offer. I have never believed that timing was a coincidence." "You believe the Doyle family set the fire themselves," Cale said quietly. "I believe it," Mira said, "though I have never had any way to prove it. I was returning from the market when I saw the smoke rising from our roof. By the time I reached the house, the flames had already spread too far. I tried to go inside, tried to reach my parents and my brother, but the heat was too intense. A neighbor pulled me back before the roof collapsed." Her hand rose unconsciously to her scarred jaw. "This is where an ember caught me, during those last moments before I was pulled away." Cale's expression had grown darker with each detail, a slow, simmering anger building beneath his controlled exterior. "And afterward," he said, "the Doyle family accused you of setting the fire yourself? They claimed I had grown resentful of my father's stubbornness, that I wished to force a sale of the land through some misguided attempt at tragedy," Mira said, her voice hardening with old, buried bitterness. "It was absurd, of course, But they had influence, and I had nothing but grief and a scarred face to offer in my own defense. I fled before formal accusations could be filed, terrified of what might happen if the matter were brought before a biased local council, eager to please a powerful neighboring family. "And the land?" Cale asked. "The Doyle family acquired it within the year," Mira said quietly, "for a price far below its actual value, citing the property as abandoned following the tragedy and my own disappearance." Cale sat back in his chair, processing the full weight of what she had shared, his mind already working through the implications. "Mira," he said slowly, "the anonymous letter that reached the council specifically mentioned the fire and the suspicion surrounding it. Whoever sent that letter had access to detailed, accurate information about events that occurred far from these lands, events you have kept carefully hidden for 3 years." Mira's eyes widened slightly as the implications settled over her. "You believe someone from my past discovered where I was living?" "I believe it is far more likely," Cale said grimly, "that someone with the resources to investigate a household servant's background, someone with a clear motive to see you removed from your position here, deliberately sought out this information to use against you." He paused, his expression darkening further. "I intend to find out exactly who sent that letter, and I have a strong suspicion of where to begin looking." The following morning, Cale summoned Finn to his study and laid out everything Mira had shared, along with his own suspicions regarding the timing and source of the anonymous accusation. Finn listened carefully, his expression growing increasingly troubled as the pieces began falling into place. "Elaine Vance," Finn said slowly, once Cale had finished. "You believe she is behind this?" "She has clear motive," Cale said. "Publicly humiliated, embarrassed before her own family, and now watching a servant girl succeed where she failed so spectacularly. It would not surprise me if she sought some measure of revenge, particularly if she possessed the resources to investigate Mira's background so thoroughly." "I can make inquiries," Finn offered, quietly, without drawing attention. "If Elaine Vance, or someone connected to her family, was responsible for uncovering and spreading this information, there will likely be some trail to follow, however carefully concealed." Cale nodded grimly. "Do so. And Finn," he added, his tone growing more serious still, "I also want you to look into the Doyle family, and any records that might exist regarding the fire itself. If there is any possibility of proving Mira's innocence definitively, I want it found." Finn departed to begin his careful investigation, and Cale turned his attention next to the more immediate challenge of the Pack Council, who awaited his report on the matter with poorly concealed impatience. He requested a full council session for that same afternoon, determined to address the growing crisis directly, rather than allowing it to fester any longer in whispers and anonymous accusations. The council chamber was tense when he arrived, every elder present, their expressions ranging from grave concern to open suspicion. Osric wasted no time once the session began. "Well, Alpha," he said, "what have you learned from your conversation with the servant girl?" "Her name," Cale said firmly, "is Mira Hollis, and she is not simply a servant girl, but a woman who has cared for my children with more genuine devotion than any noble candidate this council has ever presented to me." He let the words settle before continuing. "She has confirmed that her family did indeed perish in a fire 3 years ago, and that she was, at the time, and justly accused of setting it by a neighboring family, seeking to claim her father's land through fraudulent means." "Unjustly accused, according to her own account," Fenna said sharply. "We have only her word for this version of events." "You have her word, and you have the complete absence of any actual evidence against her, beyond a single anonymous letter of highly convenient timing," Cale countered, his tone hardening. "A letter that arrived mere days after my children publicly declared their affection for her in front of 2 rejected Luna candidates, both of whom possess clear motive to see her discredited." The chamber fell silent at this pointed observation, several elders exchanging uncertain glances as the implications settled over them. "I am currently investigating the true source of this letter," Cale continued, "along with the original circumstances of the fire itself. Until that investigation is complete, I will not remove Mira from her position, based solely on unverified accusations, delivered anonymously by parties, with obvious reason to wish her harm." Osric's jaw tightened, clearly unsatisfied with this answer, though he found himself with little ground to argue against the Alpha's reasoning. "And if your investigation confirms the accusations rather than disproves them," he asked finally, "then I will act accordingly, as any responsible Alpha must," Cale said evenly. "But I will not condemn an innocent woman on rumor alone, particularly not when those spreading the rumor may well be guilty of far greater deception themselves." The council session concluded without full resolution, though Cale had at least succeeded in buying Mira the time necessary for a proper investigation to unfold. He found her waiting anxiously in the corridor outside, having been unable to focus on much else while the council deliberated her fate. "They have not dismissed you," he said gently, seeing the tension in her shoulders ease slightly at his words. "Not yet, and not while I have any say in the matter. Finn is already looking into the true source of that letter, and into the original circumstances of the fire itself. If there is any way to prove your innocence beyond doubt, we will find it." Mira's eyes filled with tears she had been fighting to hold back for hours, overwhelmed by a depth of support she had not experienced since long before the fire took everything from her. "Thank you," she whispered. "I do not know how to properly express what this means to me." "You do not need to," Cale said softly, reaching out to gently brush away a tear that had escaped down her scarred cheek, a touch so tender it startled them both into a charged, breathless silence. "Just trust that I intend to see this through to the end, whatever it takes." Neither of them spoke of the deeper feelings clearly stirring beneath the surface of that moment, both too consumed by the immediate crisis to examine them fully. But something had shifted between them nonetheless, a quiet, unspoken understanding that whatever emerged from the coming investigation, they would face it together, regardless of what the council, or anyone else, might have to say about it. Finn's investigation moved quickly once he had a clear direction to follow. Within days, he had uncovered a servant within the Vance household willing to speak, quietly, and under promise of protection, about the true source of the anonymous letter. The servant confirmed that Elaine Vance had commissioned a private investigator to research Mira's background thoroughly, and had personally drafted the letter sent to Elder Osric, working alongside another disgraced candidate named Odette, to ensure it reached the council through a source that would appear entirely unconnected to either of them. Armed with this confirmation, Finn turned his attention next to the original fire itself, traveling personally to the small village near the old Hollis land to seek out anyone who might still remember the true events of that night. It took considerable patience and no small amount of persuasion, but he eventually located an elderly neighbor, a woman named Ottilie, who had lived beside the Hollis family for decades and had witnessed far more of that terrible night than she had ever been permitted to share publicly. "I always wondered if anyone would come asking," Ottilie said, seated in her small cottage as Finn listened carefully to her account. "I saw the Doyle men that night, you understand. 2 of them, moving near the Hollis property, well before the fire started. I did not think much of it at the time, assumed they were simply passing through. It was only after the fire, after the accusations against that poor girl began circulating, that I understood what I had likely witnessed." "Why did you never come forward?" Finn asked gently. Ottilie's expression grew troubled. "The Doyle family holds considerable influence in these parts, young man. I am an old woman, with no family of my own to protect me. Living alone on a small piece of land, the Doyle family has long coveted as well. I was afraid, and I am ashamed to admit it, but I was afraid enough to stay silent while an innocent girl fled for her life, rather than risk my own safety by speaking the truth." "Would you be willing to speak now?" Finn asked carefully. "Formally, before witnesses who could bring this evidence before a proper council?" Ottilie hesitated only a moment before nodding firmly. "That poor girl has carried this burden long enough," she said. "If there is any way I can help set the record straight, I am willing to try, whatever risk it might bring to my own door." Finn returned to the Ashworth Packlands, with Ottilie's testimony carefully documented, along with additional evidence uncovered from local land records, showing the suspiciously rapid and undervalued transfer of the Hollis property to Doyle ownership, within months of the fire, a transaction that raised serious questions when examined alongside the timeline of events. He brought everything directly to Cale, who reviewed the gathered evidence with grim satisfaction, finally seeing the pieces of Mira's unjust persecution falling clearly into place. "This is more than enough to bring before the council," Cale said. And more than enough, I hope, to finally clear Mira's name beyond any reasonable doubt. He called an emergency session that same evening, requesting that all elders attend without delay, along with representatives from both the Vance and Doyle families, summoned under the guise of routine pack business, to prevent any early warning that might allow them to prepare a defense against the evidence about to be presented. Mira waited anxiously in her room while the council gathered, torn between hope and old, deeply ingrained fear that somehow, despite everything, the truth would once again fail to protect her. Cale had asked her to remain nearby, promising to send for her once the evidence had been properly presented, wanting to give her the chance to face her accusers directly, but only once the ground had been thoroughly prepared in her favor. The council chamber was tense with anticipation as Cale laid out the evidence methodically, beginning with Finn's confirmation of the letter's true source within the Vance household, moving through Audley's detailed testimony regarding the Doyle men witnessed near the property before the fire, and concluding with the suspicious land transfer records that painted an increasingly damning picture of premeditated deception. Elaine Vance, present at her father's insistence to answer for the growing scandal surrounding her name, sat rigidly in her seat, her composed exterior cracking further with each piece of evidence presented, until finally, faced with the servant's willingness to testify against her, she abandoned any further pretense of innocence. "I only sought to reveal a truth this council deserved to know," she said sharply, though her voice carried far less conviction than her earlier bold denials. "If the girl was truly innocent, then no harm has come from the matter being properly investigated." "The harm," Cale said coldly, "came from your deliberate attempt to destroy an innocent woman's reputation and position through anonymous accusation, rather than bringing any concerns forward honestly and directly. You sought revenge for your own humiliation, nothing more, and you were willing to use a genuine tragedy from her past as your weapon." The Doyle family representative, present to answer for the land dispute, grew visibly uncomfortable as Ottilie's testimony and the accompanying land records were read aloud before the full council, the evidence painting an increasingly clear picture of a family who had orchestrated a devastating fire to seize land they had coveted for generations, then allowed an innocent young woman to bear the blame for their own crime. "These are old records," the representative protested weakly, "circumstantial at best." Circumstantial evidence, combined with direct eyewitness testimony and a documented pattern of aggressive pursuit of the property in question, paints a picture this council cannot simply dismiss, Osric said, his own earlier suspicion of Mira now replaced with grave concern over the depth of injustice apparently done to her. He turned to Cale, his expression uncharacteristically humbled. "Alpha, I owe the young woman a sincere apology for my earlier assumptions. This evidence suggests strongly that she has been the victim of a terrible wrong, not the perpetrator of one." Cale nodded, satisfaction and lingering anger both evident in his expression. "I will hear that apology directly from you," he said. "But first, I believe it is time Mira herself was brought before this council, to hear the truth finally acknowledged in the very chamber where her name was so recently dragged through unjust accusation." Mira arrived a short while later, her hands trembling slightly as she stepped into the council chamber, uncertain what to expect despite Cale's earlier reassurances. The moment she entered, Osric rose from his seat, an unusual gesture of respect that immediately caught her attention. "Miss Hollis," he said, his voice heavy with genuine remorse, "on behalf of this council, I offer you my sincere apology. The evidence presented today makes clear that you were unjustly accused, both 3 years ago and again through the recent anonymous letter brought before us. You bear no responsibility whatsoever for the tragedy that took your family, and this council formally recognizes your complete innocence in this matter." Tears filled Mira's eyes as the weight of 3 years of unjust suspicion finally began to lift, the careful, guarded walls she had built around herself trembling at the sudden, overwhelming relief of public vindication. She looked toward Cale, finding him watching her with an expression of fierce, protective pride that made her breath catch in her throat. "Furthermore," Cale added, stepping forward, "given the clear evidence of deliberate deception on the part of Elaine Vance and continued suspicious activity from the Doyle family, this council will formally pursue appropriate consequences against both parties, and will simultaneously review the original land dispute with the intention of restoring rightful ownership to Mira, as the sole surviving heir of the Hollis family. The chamber erupted into murmured discussion at this final declaration, though none dared openly challenge it, given the overwhelming evidence just presented. Elaine Vance, pale and visibly shaken, rose from her seat and departed the chamber without another word, followed shortly by the deeply uncomfortable Doyle representative, both clearly understanding that their schemes had thoroughly unraveled before the very council they had hoped to manipulate. Once the chamber had cleared of everyone but Cale, Finn, and the elders, Cale crossed the room to stand before Mira, his expression softening entirely as he took both her hands in his own, an intimate gesture he made no attempt to hide despite the watching council. "It is over," he said quietly. "The truth is finally known, and no one can use that old lie against you again." Mira could not find words adequate to express the depth of her gratitude and relief, so instead, she simply allowed herself, for the first time in 3 long years, to fully believe that safety and justice were things she was permitted to have, and that perhaps, standing before her with such fierce warmth in his eyes, she had found something even more precious than either. News of the council's ruling spread through the pack house within hours, and by the following morning, the entire staff had heard some version of the truth, though few knew the full details Cale had presented so thoroughly before the elders. What mattered most to the household was simple enough to understand regardless. Mira Hollis, the quiet servant girl who had somehow tamed the Alpha's unruly twins, had been publicly and completely cleared of any wrongdoing, and the 2 noblewomen who had schemed against her had been sent away in disgrace. Greta found Mira in the kitchen early that morning, and rather than her usual gruff commentary, simply pulled her into a brief, fierce hug, before returning to her work, as though nothing unusual had occurred at all. "I always suspected there was more to your quiet ways than met the eye," she said gruffly, busying herself with the morning bread. "Glad to see the truth finally caught up to where it belonged." Mira, still adjusting to the strange new sensation of being openly supported rather than quietly tolerated, found herself smiling more easily than she had in years, the heavy weight of 3 years' unjust suspicion finally lifted from her shoulders. The following days brought further changes, some expected, others entirely surprising. Cale formally initiated proceedings to restore the Hollis family land to Mira's ownership, a process that would take some months to fully resolve given the complexities of reversing a fraudulent transfer, but one that no longer carried any real doubt as to its eventual outcome. The Doyle family, facing mounting pressure from the Pack Council and the very real threat of formal charges, quietly began negotiations to settle the matter without further public scandal. Elaine Vance's family, deeply embarrassed by their daughter's exposed scheme, issued a formal apology to the Ashworth Pack, distancing themselves publicly from her actions, though whispers suggested Elaine herself faced considerably harsher consequences within her own household once the full scope of her deception became clear to her father. Through all of this, Cale found himself spending increasing amounts of time with Mira, no longer confined solely to discussions of the twins or the ongoing investigation, but simply enjoying her company in quiet, unhurried moments that had nothing to do with duty or obligation at all. They walked together in the evenings after the twins had been settled for the night, talking of small, ordinary things, and occasionally, when the conversation drifted somewhere deeper, of the losses and fears that had shaped them both. "I never expected to feel this way again," Cale admitted one evening, as they walked slowly along the edge of the garden where the twins had once so publicly declared their attachment to her. "After Elira passed, I believed that part of my life had simply ended, that I would spend the rest of my years as nothing more than a father and an alpha, with no room left for anything softer." Mira glanced at him, her heart beating a little faster at the vulnerability in his admission. "And now?" she asked softly. Cale stopped walking, turning to face her fully, his expression open in a way she had rarely seen from him. "Now," he said quietly, "I find myself thinking of you constantly, wondering how I ever managed before you arrived, and hoping, more than I have hoped for anything in a very long time, that you might feel something similar in return." Mira's breath caught, old fears rising briefly, before being gently pushed aside by the steady, genuine warmth in his eyes. "I have tried very hard not to hope for such things," she admitted, I have lost so much already, and hope has always felt like a dangerous thing to hold on to too tightly. I understand that fear, Kale said gently, reaching out to take her hand, but I do not intend to give you any reason to lose this. Whatever comes, Mira, I want to face it together, if you will allow me that. She looked up at him, at the sincerity so plainly written across his features, and felt the last of her careful defenses finally give way entirely. I would like that, she whispered, more than I know how to properly say. Word of their growing closeness spread quickly through the pack house, though this time the gossip carried far more warmth than suspicion, the staff having witnessed enough of Mira's genuine character over the preceding weeks to welcome the possibility wholeheartedly. Even among the council elders, opinion had shifted considerably since the dramatic revelations of Elaine Vance's scheme, most now viewing Mira with a mixture of respect and quiet admiration for the strength she had shown throughout her unjust ordeal. Osric, still carrying some measure of guilt over his earlier suspicion, sought Kale out privately one afternoon to discuss the matter further. I will not pretend the idea of a servant girl rising to Luna sits entirely comfortably with every tradition I have upheld throughout my years on this council, the elder admitted. But I have watched this young woman closely these past weeks, Alpha, and I can no longer deny that she possesses precisely the qualities this pack most desperately needs. Strength, forged through genuine hardship, compassion that asks nothing in return, and a bond with your children that no amount of noble breeding could ever manufacture. Does this mean I have your support? Kale asked, unable to fully hide his surprise at the elder's shifting stance. It means, Osric said carefully, that should you choose to formally pursue this path, I will not stand in opposition, and I suspect much of this council will follow my lead, given all that has come to light. Kale thanked the elder sincerely, feeling a genuine weight lift from his shoulders at the news, though he knew the decision that mattered most had already been made within his own heart weeks earlier, regardless of what the council ultimately decided. That evening, he found Mira in the nursery as usual, reading softly to the twins as they drifted toward sleep, and he watched from the doorway for a long moment, struck once again by how completely she had transformed not just his children's world, but his own as well. Council business finished? Mira asked softly, once she noticed him standing there, carefully closing the storybook as Rue's eyes finally slipped shut. Finished, and rather encouraging, Kale said, crossing the room to sit beside her, as she gently tucked Ren into his small bed. It seems the council's opposition to unconventional paths has softened considerably these past weeks. Mira's expression grew curious, though she said nothing further, sensing there was more he wished to say. Mira's expression continuing. Mira, he said quietly, I have spent these past months searching for a Luna to stand beside me, someone who could care for this pack, and more importantly, someone who could truly love my children as their own. Every candidate presented to me failed, not through any true fault of their own, but simply because none of them were you. He paused, taking her hand gently in his own. I do not wish to search any further. I want you, Mira, not merely as caretaker to my children, but as my mate, my equal, and the Luna this pack so clearly needs. Mira's eyes filled with tears, joy and disbelief mingling freely as she absorbed the full weight of his words. Kale, she whispered, using his given name for the first time, the intimacy of it settling warmly between them. Are you certain? I am not the noblewoman this council once imagined for you. You are exactly what this pack needs, Kale said firmly, and exactly what I need, whatever the council once imagined. I have never been more certain of anything in my life. Mira drew a shaking breath, looking briefly toward her sleeping children. No, she realized with a sudden, overwhelming clarity. Not merely children she cared for, but children she already loved as fiercely as if they had been born from her own heart, before turning back to meet Kale's steady, hopeful gaze. Then yes, she said softly, tears spilling freely now. Yes, I will stand beside you, Kale, as your mate, as your Luna, and as their mother, in every way that truly matters. Kale's answering smile held all the warmth and relief of a man who had finally, after years of quiet grief and uncertain searching, found his way home, and he drew her carefully into his arms, mindful of the sleeping children nearby, sealing their new understanding with a gentle, promising kiss that spoke of everything still to come. The acceptance ceremony was arranged for a bright, clear morning, several weeks later. The entire pack gathered within the great courtyard of the Ashworth estate, banners bearing the pack's crest fluttering gently in the breeze. Word of the unusual match, an alpha choosing a former servant girl as his Luna, had traveled far beyond the pack's own borders, drawing curious onlookers from neighboring territories eager to witness the ceremony firsthand. Mira stood in a quiet antechamber, dressed in a simple but elegant gown of deep blue, her dark hair arranged carefully to frame her face rather than hide the scar along her jaw, a scar she had fully stopped feeling ashamed of. Greta fussed over the final details of her appearance. Tears gathered unashamedly in the older woman's eyes as she smoothed an invisible wrinkle from the fabric. "Never thought I would see the day," Greta murmured, "but I cannot imagine a finer Luna for this pack, truth be told." Mira reached out and squeezed the older woman's hand gratefully, unable to find adequate words for the strange, wonderful journey that had brought her to this exact moment. 2 years ago, she had arrived at these very gates with nothing but a small bag of belongings and a heart too wounded to hope for anything beyond simple survival. Now, she stood on the threshold of becoming Luna to an entire pack, mother to 2 children who had claimed her heart completely, and mate to a man whose steady, unwavering support had helped her finally release the last of the fear and shame she had carried for so long. A soft knock sounded at the door, and Finn stepped inside, offering a warm smile. "It is time," he said gently. "The children are waiting for you at the entrance, insisting they walk beside you rather than with the household staff." Mira laughed softly, wiping quickly at the sudden dampness in her eyes. "Of course they are," she said. "I would not have it any other way either." She made her way toward the courtyard entrance, where Ren and Rue waited, dressed in matching small outfits of deep blue to complement her own gown, their faces bright with excited anticipation. The moment they spotted her, both children abandoned any pretense of formal composure and rushed forward, wrapping themselves around her legs with familiar, joyful enthusiasm. "Mama, you look so pretty," Rue declared loudly, drawing gentle laughter from the nearby staff who had gathered to watch the procession begin. "Thank you, my love," Mira said, kneeling to press a gentle kiss to each of their foreheads. "Are you both ready to walk with me?" Ren nodded solemnly, taking her hand with the careful seriousness only a small child could bring to such an important task, while Rue immediately claimed her other hand, practically vibrating with excitement at the prospect of the ceremony ahead. Together, the 3 of them made their way toward the courtyard entrance, where Cale waited, dressed in formal attire befitting the occasion, his expression softening into open, unguarded warmth the moment he caught sight of them approaching. "You look beautiful," he murmured, once Mira had drawn close enough to hear him privately, his gaze holding hers with a depth of affection that still, even now, sent a flutter of disbelief through her chest at how completely her life had transformed. "Thank you," she whispered back, "though I confess I am rather nervous." "You need not be," Cale said gently. "This pack already loves you, Mira, perhaps even before they fully understood why. Today is simply a formal acknowledgement of something that has been true for weeks now." They processed together into the courtyard, the assembled pack falling into respectful silence as Cale led Mira and their children toward the raised platform at the courtyard's center, where Osric waited to formally conduct the acceptance ceremony. Mira could feel hundreds of eyes upon her, curious, warm, and largely welcoming, a stark contrast to the wary suspicion that had once followed her through these same grounds as an unremarkable servant girl. Osric began the ceremony with the traditional words, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet courtyard, speaking of pack unity, of the sacred bond between Alpha and Luna, of the responsibility and honor such a role carried. When the moment came for him to formally present Mira to the gathered pack, he paused, setting aside a portion of the traditional script to add words entirely his own. "I will confess," he said, his voice carrying genuine warmth now, rather than the stern formality he was known for, "that I once doubted whether this unconventional path could lead to anything but difficulty for our pack. I was wrong, and I say so gladly. This woman has shown more genuine strength, compassion, and devotion than any candidate born to noble bloodline could have offered. She has earned her place among us not through inheritance or arrangement, but through the truest measure available to any of us, the quiet, steady goodness of her own heart. A murmur of agreement rippled through the gathered crowd, and Mira felt tears gathering once more, overwhelmed by the depth of acceptance she had never dared to imagine possible. Osric turned to face her directly. "Mira Hollis," he said formally, "do you accept the role of Luna to this pack, promising to serve its members with wisdom, compassion, and unwavering loyalty?" "I do," Mira said clearly, her voice steady despite the emotions swelling within her chest. "And do you accept the sacred bond of mate to Alpha Kale Ashworth, and mother to his children, Ren and Rue, promising to love and protect them as fiercely as your own life?" Mira glanced down at the two small faces looking up at her with complete trust and adoration, then back to Kale, whose expression held nothing but certainty and love. "I do," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "With my whole heart, I do." The courtyard erupted into joyful cheering, the formal ceremony complete, and Kale drew her close, sealing the moment with a tender kiss that spoke of everything they had overcome to arrive at this point together. Ren and Rue, not to be left out of the celebration, wrapped themselves around both their parents' legs, giggling with pure, uncomplicated happiness. As the formal ceremony gave way to a joyous celebration throughout the pack grounds, music and laughter filling the bright afternoon air, Mira found a quiet moment to step slightly apart from the festivities, gazing out over the packlands that had once felt so foreign and frightening to her, and now, finally, felt entirely like home. Kale found her there a short while later, slipping an arm gently around her waist as he joined her at the edge of the gathering. "Regrets?" he asked softly, only half teasing. Mira shook her head, leaning into his warmth. "Not a single one," she said. "For so long, I believed that scar," she touched her jaw lightly, "marked me as something broken, something to hide away and be ashamed of. I never imagined it might instead lead me to exactly where I was always meant to be." Kale pressed a gentle kiss to her temple, his voice warm with quiet certainty. "It led you home," he said simply, "to us." Behind them, Ren and Rue had abandoned their earlier game to run toward their parents, small arms outstretched, twin voices calling out the same word that had first begun this entire remarkable journey weeks earlier, a word that no longer needed explanation or correction, a word that had simply, finally, become true. "Mama? Papa?" Mira knelt to gather them both into her arms, laughing through fresh tears as Kale knelt beside her, wrapping his own arms around all three of them at once. And for the first time since the fire had taken everything she once knew, Mira allowed herself to fully believe in the promise of a future built not on fear or survival, but on genuine, hard-won love, exactly the kind every scarred and broken heart deserved to find, if it was only patient enough to wait for it.